I'm going to talk tonight about a trip I did in 2004, and I haven't really looked at the pictures since because they were slides, not digital. But I've spent the last couple of weeks organising a lot of old slides, and it's enabled me to visit some of these trips from the past. I made my first visit to the Karakorum in 1987. I was working for a publisher in London. I took the summer off to go climbing and decided that this was a lot more fun than commuting between Brixton and King's Cross on the Northern Line. I quit my job and essentially since then have been leading expeditions to the Himalaya. In the last decade, perhaps some into Nepal, but prior to that, a good 20 years in the Karakoram. I started off leading trekking trips for customers and then climbing trips with friends from the British climbing community. But as the years went on, I moved into guiding higher altitude expeditions, and I led 6 expeditions to 8,000 meter peaks in the Karakoram. During this time, I was doing some recreational ski touring in Europe. However, I became aware of the opportunity for some adventurous skiing on the big glaciers of the Karakoram. And I led 2 trips in 1996 and 1997 to do what's probably the most obvious ski trip in the Karakoram. And that's the classic summer trip between Hunza and Baltistan, linking the Hispar and Biafo glaciers. On the map, these both look like 60-kilometre glaciers. However, the first third, the first 20 kilometres is taken up with moraine. So there's really only 40k on each of snow. And then they're joined by this pass at just over 5,000 metres, the Hispar Pass. From the top of the pass, we were able to leave the sleds and do some exploring. I will just say at this point that the long trip I'm about to talk about was quite tough, and I really don't expect many people to be queuing up to attempt it after seeing tonight's pictures. But for anyone interested in a less expensive, less demanding trip, something like the Biafo Hispar can be done quite cheaply, probably less expensively than a North American, a Canadian or an Alaskan glacier trip. You do need some local contacts to understand the environment a bit more, but passes up to 5,000 metres and peaks up to 6,000 metres are quite possible on a 3-week trip. Not all good weather and fun, and getting onto the glacier and off at the end often involves a bit of hard work carrying packs. From all my years working in the Karakoram, I became more and more interested in the history of exploration, which really revolved around finding passes over the main Karakoram watershed between what was then British India and in the later 19th century, there was Imperial Russian influence in Turkestan, and then after that, Chinese. It was all to do with trying to find passes over the Karakoram which could be of some military interest. However, these were all in quite inaccessible places. There's a number of reasons why it'd be very difficult to visit these in summer. They are on the international border between China and Pakistan, and you really shouldn't be going there. So getting permission to go in summer and porters to accompany you would be a bit difficult. Just to point out, the Hispar and Biafo trip crossed this section with just one pass. And the journey I'm going to talk about tonight is much longer. It's essentially the yellow line, and the pink bits are the 6 passes that have to be crossed. So this is the Hunza area, and this is Skardu and Baltistan. And in order to link them, basically following the international border, the watershed of the Karakoram, I came up with a route which crossed 6 high passes, all of which are of quite significant historical interest. And as well as talking about my journey to cross them, I'm going to talk a little about the history of exploration. I'd been planning this trip for quite a few years, and there were at least a dozen people at various times sign up to join. But for one, it got cancelled in 2002 because I hurt my back. It got cancelled in 2003 because I went to climb Everest. But eventually in 2004, I assembled this group of 5 people who'd never met each other before. Grant and Annette are both from Tasmania and had travelled together, but the other 3, Robert, Ashley, and Dave, had never met each other. And my connection was that Grant had climbed Tirich with me in 1995, and Ashley had been with me on Gasherbrum in 1991. We flew from Islamabad to Skardu, where I keep an equipment store, organised all our stuff, left the things we'd need for the homeward journey, and then hired this bus to travel to Hunza. So initially, the Indus Highway between Skardu and Gilgit, and then on up the Karakoram Highway to Hunza. I had been into our start village of Shimshal twice in the 1990s, and in those days there wasn't a road. It was a pretty difficult 3-day hike. And the district commissioner in Gilgit in the 1930s had said that Gilgit was the most isolated and inaccessible settlement in the British Empire. A road has been built, which in any list of the world's 10 most dangerous roads does feature. But in early April, the village of Shimshal was looking pretty bleak, about 3,000 metres, but not really out of winter conditions. And this much more pleasant shot is what it looks like in the autumn. So we gathered all our equipment and hired 20 porters. Now, to save me remembering times and distances for each day, I've put them up in the top corner. I won't necessarily refer to them unless they're of noticeable significance. But it is worth noting that with all my more modern trips, I use a more modern GPS and I actually track the distance each day. Whereas these figures, I was carrying a much older, much simpler GPS, and I only turned it on each evening at the campsite to log the actual location of that camp. So these daily distances are a direct, as the crow flies, point to point, from one camp to the next. And when I got around to entering these, I did notice that some of them are remarkably small distances, but you'll see why later. The hike from the village of Shimshal up to the top of the Shimshal Pass is by no means an easy walk. And although I'd done it before, I was quite surprised at just how fragile some of these trails were. And this leads through a very dry, rocky landscape to a bit of naturally occurring high pasture where the Shimshalis go ibex hunting in the season. And they also take their herds of animals, sheep, goats, and cows, along these very faint paths up to the high altitude pass. So the first of the 6 passes we're going to cross, we do have porters with us. We knew there was going to be snow, so we crossed it on skis while the poor porters managed the long post-holing. And you do see on top of the pass this cairn, which is referred to by anyone who would travel there as Young Husband's Cairn. Because although in older times this pass had been used by local people, usually raiders from Hunza attacking trade caravans in Turkestan, the first Westerner to cross it and record it was Francis Younghusband in 1889. And it's one of the things that featured in this iconic book of his. The book will appear later. This is not quite a first edition, but near those dates. And this is showing Younghusband as a young man in the library of the RGS. A summer shot of the Shimshal Pass shows it's much more benign. And when I was there on a summer trip, we met local families with their herds. But clearly, in the winter, a very different landscape. dropping down the other side to the Skardu River, and then walking for a couple of miles on the frozen river. This is our 6th day of travel to the edge of the glacier, where we paid off most of the porters. I think my diary says we paid off 9 here. We kept 7 porters who slept overnight in the kitchen, and the next day they were going to carry our stuff as far as they could, drop it, and then return. So our last day with the porters, 7th day out, they took us up. We hoped they would be able to take us to somewhere where we could ski. Turned out not quite to be the case. But after a week of quite poor weather, we then had a bit of an improvement. And on this day, day 8, we didn't actually make any forward progress, but we moved half of our equipment 6 kilometers up the glacier. And then the following day, we moved the other half to establish this camp. Our first day skiing, everything should have gone well. We'd have hoped to make some decent progress, but you'll see we only moved for 2.5 hours because Robert developed a bit of a chest infection and we had to stop early. And it was pretty much touch and go as to whether on the first ski day of this journey we would have to abandon everything and just turn around and go back. But we set up camp, and the next morning he felt improved and we were finally able to start moving. And although I think on this day I wasn't terribly pleased at the progress rate of 8 kilometers in 6 hours, when I look back at how the rest of the trip went, this was actually one of the more successful distance days. This terrain much more suited to pulling sledges. And we got to a campsite, good weather. I think things are starting to look up a bit. Next day, a bit more dull, but making progress. Then, however, it snowed all day. We were confined to the tents, and this is an evening shot when the weather finally cleared. 50 centimeters of snow had fallen, and the next morning we're able to dig everything clear and make reasonable progress across easier ground to the second of the 6 passes we were aiming for, just over 5,500 meters. These are 2 gentlemen that you'll see a few times this evening. In the hat, Bill Tillman, and the taller man, Eric Shipton. They are legends among Himalayan exploration in Nepal, India, and the Karakoram. But what interests me particularly are the 2 long trips they took to the Karakoram in 1937 and 1939, when they basically filled in all the gaps that had not been done by the Victorian explorers, and found numerous ways of crossing the main Karakoram watershed. And it was actually Tillman at the end of the 1939 expedition who had been the first person to cross this particular pass. Short journey down the other side, weather not ideal when we set up camp. And then a poor progress day the following day. We were only 5 or 6 kilometers from the next pass, but in poor weather, made half that journey before we had to stop. And the following day, the weather was really too bad to make any progress. So a rest day in the tents. Then a fairly stunning number in the annals of ski travel, 1.3 kilometers in 11.5 hours. The snow was quite deep at the beginning, as you'll see, but the main problem was the ground got very steep. And although there was only 300 meters of height gain, it took us all day to get our loads, which When we were fully laden, they weren't far short of 50 kilos food, fuel and equipment, and when they were lighter they came down to about 40. So we couldn't carry them on an individual carry, and when we got to difficult ground like this we had to essentially relay. So one climb up with a full rucksack and then down, and then we were carrying 350 meters of, I would call it rope, but much of it was 7mm cord, but it was suitable for hauling sleds. And to cut a long story short, it took all day to get all the equipment up this pass through some pretty deep snow. But we're very grateful at the top to find a level campsite with a good view down over the terrain we crossed. And this pass, so we've crossed the Loup Kila, fairly short journey around here, to the Skamla. We're now on top of this pass, and that was first climbed by Eric Shipton on the 1939 expedition. A cold night on the top, we recorded -25, and then the following day we looked over the other side. We got our first view of K2 in the distance, and because, although we've now been going over 2 weeks, this is the first time that we've got any downhill with skis, so for the first time we're actually making a decent distance, almost 20 kilometers in a day. The bit at the top, it wasn't fantastically steep, but any of you that have ever tried pulling sleds across snow know that the downhill is often as difficult as the uphill. So after dealing with this fairly tricky bit at the beginning, we got onto some more level terrain. And I will just say that this feature here was climbed by a French ski group a couple of years ago who skied the face. It's not massively high, it's only a couple hundred meters, the steep bit, although I do agree it is quite steep. But there's a fantastic video on YouTube. It lasts about an hour, and it's called Zabardast, beginning with a Z. And I'll type that in the comments later. And they traveled very much as we did, but with alpine rather than Nordic equipment. And the whole aim of the expedition was to ski this face, which I think only one member of the team actually did at the end. But for us on Nordic equipment, this was the day when we made real progress. We dropped 1,300 meters in a day into the valley, and then the following day on hard ground, Annette demonstrating a very good demonstration of skate skiing while pulling a sled. And this day was notable because this was when we picked up our resupply. We'd realised at the beginning that it would be very difficult to carry more than a month's food and fuel through this terrain. So before leaving Skardu, I'd arranged with some porters I'd worked with before to travel about a week into the mountains. And for people who don't read and can't read maps, it had been a little difficult explaining exactly where we wanted this supply drop left. And I'd issued them with quite clear instructions to make these flags with a bit of stick and a bit of red cloth. And it was with some anxiety that we skied down this valley until we saw the red flag flying and realised that we picked up 100 kilos of food and fuel that would keep us going for another 2 weeks. At this point, we were 1 day behind what I thought would be our anticipated schedule. So we didn't take a rest. We didn't stop where the supply was. We loaded everything and kept going for the afternoon. Not particularly easy ground. The sleds were now quite a bit heavier. And I suppose what made the travel difficult was the inconsistency. If it had been all stones or all ice or all snow, we could have coped with it. But we hit a fairly challenging period. The worst being just not being able to move forward because of bad weather. Then in 8 hours of effort, we made under 4 kilometers, basically having to do the whole journey twice, transporting half the equipment, walking back, transporting the other half. Occasional bits where we could ski, and then bits where we couldn't. And these 4 or 5 days were really pretty tough. It'd be interesting to talk to my companions from the trip and see what their memories were. But it was a whole variety of things that as soon as we solved one, we just got hit with another. As well as the bad weather and difficult route finding on this day, it was Annette's turn to feel ill. So we weren't going very fast, but after 3 hours, she didn't feel great and we had to stop. Even though we're moving, it was hard to tell if being on the glacier and dealing with the ice cliffs would be more difficult, or being on the moraine, dealing with the rocks. The next day, we put in a long shift, alternating between the two, but didn't make much distance, although the weather did clear in the evening. And then it was the following day, the weather improved, but again, one member of the party was feeling quite ill, and we felt it would be unwise, unsafe to push them on. So we stopped at less than 2 kilometers in less than ideal weather. Then we were due a bit of good luck. The time is long, the distance isn't great, deep snow really being what slowed us down, but with good visibility we could see we were making progress. And not easy in this kind of terrain to understand where the best line would be. We knew now we were quite close to the pass. On our 26th day, we were finally able to cross the West Muztag Pass. This again, historical records would indicate that it was a trade route. The glaciers were clearly quite different centuries ago, but the first Westerner to cross it was actually a member of the Shipton Tillman 1939 expedition, a man called Edric Fontaine. And you can see our terrible progress. And when I look back at my diary, to cover 15 kilometers took us 6 days. We thought we'd have done it in 2, and by this point, we're now 5 days behind schedule. But on easier ground and heading downhill. This another named pass in the area, the Sarpolago Pass, but not one we were choosing to cross. Reasonably benign terrain. We're able to cover the distance. This side, we're now on the Chinese side of the frontier for a couple of days, heading towards the East Muztag Pass. And despite the fact we'd been getting these very cold temperatures on the high passes, a problem we had to deal with during the days were the heat. And we did have to cut several days short because we were just struggling through this deep snow at over 5,000 meters, pulling heavy sleds in debilitating heat. We made the top of the East Muztag Pass, heading back into Pakistan. Did a recce in the afternoon. This is looking down into the Baltoro Glacier. And when people came to look back at Young Husband's journey, the crossing of the Muztag Pass was seen to have been one of the most significant elements of it. This is a reprint of his famous book on the 50th anniversary of the journey, showing him as a much older man, this one in the collection of the Alpine Club. He's been knighted by this point. He's now Sir Francis Young Husband, and the write-up of the book on the front lists the crossing of the Muztag Pass as being one of the most significant achievements of this journey. And this is the photograph of the pass which appears in his book. We don't have time to read the thing in full, but the fact that he says he had no ice axes or mountaineering equipment and no mountaineering experience. Makes it all the more remarkable that he got his group of local porters over this pass. Because you'll see from my figures that forward distance wasn't very great, and even with 350 meters of rope, everybody having ice axes and crampons, it took us a full 5 hours just to get down this pass, which did feel quite precarious, quite a warm day, quite threatened from above. And when we got down, we moved as far or as short a distance as we felt would keep us safe away from the avalanche danger before setting up camp. And then on the whole trip, we only had 3 sections of skiing which could be classed as enjoyable and without too much effort, heading downhill on fairly firm ground, pulling the sled, and that shows that we made fairly decent progress. This is Gasherbrum from the north, one of the peaks that dominate the middle section of the Baltoro Glacier. And then we camped at the edge of the Baltoro. Satellite photographs weren't that easily available back in these days, but I had come across a few in the planning stage. We've come across the West Muztag Pass here, traversed to the East Muztag and down to the edge of the Baltoro. And I had been hoping for the sort of snow cover that this diagram shows, that we'd be able to ski all the way down the Muztag Glacier and then get onto this big white corridor of the Baltoro as we head for the Karakorum Pass. That wasn't to be the case, but we did have another problem. We were now 5 days behind schedule, had been making pretty slow progress and didn't know what the ground ahead would look like. We might have been able to eke out the rations and have the whole team carry on, but we had a fairly long discussion, and for a number of, it also looked likely that we might miss our international flights home. Some of the team had commitments to get back to, and so reluctantly we reached the decision that 3 members of the team would take essentially the short route down the Baltoro Glacier to Ascoli, return to Skardu and go home after having crossed 5 out of the 6 planned passes. But by handing their supplies to the other 3 members, it would guarantee that they would have enough food and fuel to continue. So I think Annette, Grant and myself are still very grateful to the other 3 for making that decision and allowing us to continue. And before leaving, everybody carried all the supplies 3 kilometres south to the southern edge of the Baltoro before Robert, Dave and Ashley headed for home. We had been hoping that on the southern edge of the glacier, because it would be sheltered by the shadow of the peaks, that the snow cover would be continuous. But we had 2 very unpleasant and difficult days where we put in long days and made little progress, as this was clearly ground that you couldn't pull sleds through. And at some point we had to lower the sleds with ropes down quite steep slopes and then climb after. And on this particular day, I was out front and I punched, we were skiing across a frozen lake, and I punched through and went into my waist and got everything very cold and wet. And then having to relay the equipment, double carries, 8.5 hours hard work to go less than 2.5 kilometres. And we always thought that around the next corner that the ground would open up, but finally it did. And the type of terrain that I think we'd been hoping to meet a lot more of, that allows, 8 hours of reasonably hard work, but if we could cover 10 kilometres every day, we'd have been able to keep to our schedule. And this just shows the daily distances on the difficult ground compared to the daily distances when we hit the good ground, obviously able to cover much better distances. And as we approach Concordia, we see these classic views, which anybody who's been up there climbing or trekking will get. The west face of Gasherbrum IV, Gasherbrum II just poking out. And then approaching Concordia, we have Broad Peak. Looking to the east towards the line of control, this is Sia Kangri, just next to the Conway Saddle, and the Indian forces are just the other side of that mountain. Not all flat, some ups and downs, but on firm snow, we can make decent progress. And then the classic view of K2 as we turn south into the Vine Glacier towards the sixth and final pass, the Gondokoro. We had surplus, although we did 2 difficult days, we did 2 good days. We had a reasonable bit of spare food, which we just kept 1 day's ration. We dropped everything else in a crevasse because we knew that once we got to the top of this final pass, it would be downhill all the way. This is commonly crossed in the summer. I'll mention that in a minute, but the route isn't that obvious, and so we were hoping for decent conditions to pick our way up. But the following day, we did have to climb it in some quite poor weather. We got right into the base, so although it took us 8 hours to climb the 2 kilometers, that was all we needed to get to the top of the pass. We put everything in our rucksacks and just dragged the empty sledges up the steep ground to the top. We got to the top pretty cold, wet and tired, got the tent up, just fell into it and went to sleep for a couple of hours, just wearing all our clothes. Following day, the weather improved and we had the view ahead of where we were heading. I didn't mention at the beginning, but of the 20 porters I'd taken with us to Shimshal, 2 of them were friends of mine from the Hushe Valley. And they had worked as our cooks on the walk-in. And I had directed them, I'd given them a specific date to join us at the corner. It's a campsite called Dalsan, in 30 days' time. So they were supposed to be here 30 days after we'd left them. And although we were a day late, they were there on time. So in good weather, we took a final view back over the Baltoro. This, the classic view of the 4 Gasherbrum peaks, 1, 2, 3, and 4, which you see from the top of the Gondokoro. And then we were quite concerned about avalanche risk, so we spent more than an hour gathering together any loose boulders we could see and just rolling them down the slopes in front of us to try and set off any loose snow, and then down climb to the bottom, where we were able to put the skis on, and this, the third and final relatively easy ski, this the slope of the Gondokoro that we crossed. And then at the corner, we got to where the snow ran out, unhitched the sleds, and in less than 30 minutes, 6 porters from Hushe that we had organised came to help us carry the equipment. So with light packs, we left the snow behind and got to the first greenery we'd seen in over a month. And to demonstrate that we're not always completely useless, when we finally hit level ground, in 2 hours we did manage to walk 8 kilometers. And if the terrain had been a bit easier on the previous days, we'd have been looking at figures like that rather than 2 kilometers in 8 hours. And it was the porters were all guys that I'd worked with a lot, and I think they know the mountains quite well. They have a fair bit of respect for them. But when they'd left us in Shimshal, I think they had thought that we were barking mad and that there wasn't much chance of us. And no, it was in they told us when we finally got to the village that all the villagers had been praying for us in the local mosque. And when they'd set off to come and find us, many of their friends had said, "You're wasting your time. You saw these guys a month ago, 200 miles away. There's no way they're going to pop up out of the mountains." So they were really pleased to see us, and we were really pleased to get help for the final section. And the jeep we'd organised was waiting for us. Took us to Skardu, and that was the end of the trip. So that's the brief tale of how I came to ski past K2 base camp. A trip which I don't think I'll be doing again. There's a small community of people who have been doing ski expeditions in the Karakorum. There's a French guide who lives near Chambéry, who's led a couple of trips over the Biafo Hispar, and some Americans who've done a trip up to Snow Lake. Clearly, when you're researching a trip like that, it's not difficult to find the names of people that have been there before. And from time to time, people contact me asking information about out here. Even though it was 25 years ago, if I was doing the same trip now, I don't really think there's much that I'd change. Clearly, there is some equipment you can get now that's a little bit lighter. With climate change, the glaciers are all receding. I think you would have a better chance of more snow if you went maybe a month earlier. But our reason for not going earlier was that we're really worried about the cold temperatures. The lowest temperatures of -25 were pretty tough. And I do think if you went in March, it could be 10 degrees colder. But that's a moot point. I'd be interested to hear who else is going out there doing similar things and what they think about it. But that's the story of my trip, and I'd be happy to take any questions from anyone.
That's great. Thank you, David. That's really, really interesting and not at all motivating, actually. I can't say I watched that and thought, my God, I have to do that. So please type questions into the chat, and then David can pick them up by just following the chat. So we've got a question from Scouse. How many calories are you burning each day, and are you eating lard?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've never actually gone into the science. On those kind of trips, I find that the figure I work on is 1 kilo per person per day, and sometimes that's food and fuel. So we're burning about 125 grams of per. So it's either 900 grams of food and 100 grams of gas, or 1,000 of food. Not massively high calorie. We didn't take a high fat diet on that. The dehydrated food you could buy 25 years ago wasn't as good as the stuff today. We probably had a lot more chocolate than my dentist would like. But yeah, just stuff that'll last for the duration and is easy to pack. Yeah.
Great. A question from John. Political issues being so close to or crossing the Chinese border, the wooden button surveillance nowadays make it more difficult?
That's a good question. I tend to think that in those days the Chinese did not have spy satellites monitoring their borders, but I'm almost certain they do now. And I think if you were doing that trip, you might get something flying high over you. Although it would probably, I don't want to go into it in too much detail, but I think as long as you're reasonably quick, you'd be able to get back onto the Pakistan side before anyone got too close. but it might be advantageous if you were trying to plan a trip now to try and get one that's stuck within one country.
Do you remember when we were on the East Muztag Pass, that plane came over?
Yes, I wasn't going to mention that, but yes, we did have some evidence that there were spy satellites around at that time.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Is there anywhere in there that actually provides great skiing as against slogging, basically?
That's a very hard one. As I say, this video, Zabardast, is fantastic. You know, it's the terrain we were traveling through, but it's shot by a professional video cameraman, and he's got fantastic shots. But essentially, when you look into it, a team of half a dozen of them traveled through that terrain for 3 weeks in order to do one 500-meter descent. I don't really think the Karakoram mountains are great for skiing. You know, even if you'd a sponsor, let's say somebody gave you the money to ski one of the 8,000-meter peaks, and G2 would probably be the best option. The snow on it's going to be best in April or May, and at that time, getting in there is going to be really difficult. It'd be much easier to get in the summer expedition season, but then the chances of skiable snow are quite low. So as with India, where the best skiing has been found to be in the foothills at Gulmarg, I think if there was to be skiing in Pakistan, you'd probably find better ski objectives in the foothills, which are not, you know, in Swat, which are not the popular high mountain areas.
Right, makes sense. So, any more questions from anybody?
Yeah, I think on the ski front, you know, I do all sorts of ski trips, and some of them are for the joy of finding good skiing. But on that particular trip, I wanted to get to particular places that it wasn't practical to go to in the summer, because you'd have needed hundreds of porters and you'd have you created a lot of attention. The reason I used skis was pulling a sled allowed us to be autonomous. We could travel with 2 or 3 weeks food and fuel. And so the ski and the sled was a tool to enable travel in that environment rather than taking skis to enjoy the descent.
David, it's Ashley.
Yeah.
Could you just quickly, you've done over 100 trips, just rate this trip in terms of like a hierarchy of great trips you've been on?
Yeah, that's a good one. No, it's definitely, yeah, I'm almost saying it was the most satisfying trip I've ever done. I'm not, but it gets difficult to compare things that are really different. You know, I think in 10 or 20 or 30, no, in my obituary, when someone's looking at all the things I've done and saying, well, okay, this guy's been up Everest, but hey, loads of people have done that. I think somebody might look at the map and say, you know, God, that was an absolutely bonkers thing to do, spending more than a month dragging sleds across the Karakoram. And I think even without the political problems, it could easily be 50 years before someone else was daft enough to try the same thing. So yes, it was an unusual type of trip to plan, and it took quite a mix of skills to make it happen. Oh, Martin, what are you doing?
Yeah. Got it. Hello, hi there. I'm glad that we did it in the summer, and I avoided doing it in the winter. It looks much nicer in the summer. Great, good trip, or bits of it anyway.
Yeah, I could say I have returned and done some parts of that trip in the summer with people like Martin from Edinburgh, who's just pitched up.
Mm.
Someone's asking about the pictures. No, these were all slides, and I did scan them. So yeah, these are slides that have been scanned.
A question as well about whether you would have considered using Alpine touring kit.
That's a good question, because if you look closely at the feet, 4 of us were on with a mixture. 2 people were on alpine equipment, simply because that's what they had. You know, this wasn't a group of skiers who were looking to go on a ski expedition. It was a group of people who'd done different types of mountaineering who wanted to travel through the mountains. And those that were comfortable with Nordic equipment brought that because it's what they had. But and there was a mix. 2 people were on leather telemark boots. 2 people were on plastic telemark boots were just coming in. But Ashley was on alpine randonnée equipment. And on my Biafo Hispar trip, more people did that in randonnée equipment than Nordic. On the whole, Nordic was best, but on the few kind of bits where there was some downhill skiing, you needed to be a bit brave to build up any speed on kind of lightweight 3-pin bindings with a 20-kilo sled behind you.
Great. So I think that seems like quite a good place to finish it up. Thank you, David. Utterly crazy, completely mad. Very interesting. I'm glad somebody else did it, so the rest of us don't have to. Thank you, everybody, for coming. If you want more of David, he's going to be talking about his also fairly crazy Pyrenees ski crossing from this winter. That's going to be in person at the Eagle Ski Club AGM, I think in early December. And then our next virtual lecture is going to be 19th of August, same time. And our president, Dave Wynne-Jones, is going to be talking about accessible wilderness skiing in New Zealand.